The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was setting up chairs for a wedding rehearsal. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, didn't bother with hello. "You have 72 hours to give this place back to us," she said. "Marcus is taking over." Then she hung up before I could say a single word back. I stood there in the middle of the lawn, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to a dial tone where my mother-in-law's voice had just been. Would you have called back right away, demanding answers? Or would you have needed a minute first, just to understand what you were even being asked to hand over? I stood in that field for a long time before I did either, because the thing about being told to give something back is that it only makes sense if you believe it was never really yours to begin with. Here's what Eleanor didn't know, or maybe just didn't care to remember. 5 years ago, when Marcus and I got married, he gave me this house as a wedding gift. A rundown farmhouse on 11 acres in the Hudson Valley. The kind of property his family considered a consolation prize compared to the Manhattan penthouse life they actually wanted for their son's wife. I didn't take it as a consolation prize. I took it as a foundation. Over 5 years, I turned that broken down farmhouse into Whitfield Hollow, an event venue that now books weddings 18 months in advance. I did the renovation planning myself. I learned a zoning law. I hired local contractors when nobody thought a 30-year-old wife with no business degree could pull any of it off. Marcus, meanwhile, was building something else entirely in the city, a real estate development firm that looked impressive on paper and, I would later learn, was held together with financing decisions that made my stomach turn. Somewhere in those 5 years, he'd also been building a second life with a woman named Christine in a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side that he'd bought her outright the same year I was still negotiating payment plans with a roofing contractor. I found out about Christine 8 months ago. I didn't find out about the apartment until much more recently, and honestly, it explained a lot of things that had never quite added up. Standing in that field, with Eleanor's threat still echoing in my ear, I understood something for the first time with total clarity. This wasn't really about the house. This was about money, and I was fairly sure I already knew whose money had run out first. I called my business partner, a woman named Priya, who handled our event calendar and half our vendor relationships, and told her what had happened. She went quiet on the other end of the line for a second. "Grace," she said carefully, "please tell me you have this place in your name, not just Marcus's." I did. That was the one thing I'd insisted on back when the gift was first offered, that the deed be put solely in my name. At the time, Eleanor had scoffed at the request, called it unnecessarily formal for a wedding gift. Marcus signed off on it anyway, mostly, I think, because he never imagined it would matter. But Eleanor's phone call told me something Priya's question hadn't fully prepared me for. If they were demanding I hand it back, that meant somebody believed there was still a way to take it from me, deed or no deed. And that meant I needed to understand exactly what kind of trouble Marcus's business, and by extension his family, was actually in. I hung up with Priya and sat down on the porch steps of the house I'd built out of nothing, watching the late afternoon light hit the fields I knew every inch of, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for 72 hours to run out wondering what was coming. I was going to find out first. Some fights you walk into blind. This one, I decided, I wasn't going to. If you've ever had to dig into someone else's mess just to protect what was rightfully yours, let me know. And stick around, because what I found out about Marcus's finances in the next 24 hours changed everything about how I saw those 72 hours ticking down. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're invested in Grace's story already. I spent that night going through 5 years of shared financial records, statements Marcus had never bothered to hide from me, mostly because he'd never imagined I'd think to look. What I found wasn't a mystery so much as a slow-motion collapse that had been happening in plain sight for over a year. Marcus's development firm had bet heavily on a mixed-use project in Brooklyn that stalled out 18 months ago. Permitting delays, a contractor lawsuit, investors pulling out one after another. To keep the company alive, he'd taken out increasingly aggressive loans, some personally guaranteed. The Manhattan apartment for Christine, it turned out, had been purchased 2 years before the project stalled, back when the money was still flowing. By the time I found the real numbers, the firm was roughly $4 million underwater, and at least one lender was threatening to call in a loan personally guaranteed against, among other things, all real property held by the Whitfield family. Eleanor, I realized, wasn't calling out of cruelty exactly. She was panicking, looking for anything solid enough to throw at a creditor before the whole family name went down with Marcus's company. The problem for them was simple. Whitfield Hollow wasn't technically Whitfield family property in any legal sense that mattered. It was mine, solely, deeded 5 years earlier in a decision Eleanor had once mocked as unnecessary. I called a lawyer the next morning, not Marcus's family lawyer, someone entirely separate, a woman named Odette Marsh, who specialized in real estate and asset protection out of an office in Poughkeepsie. She listened to the whole story without interrupting once. Legally, Odette told me, they can't force a transfer just because they're asking nicely, or even threatening. If the deed is solely in your name and you never personally guaranteed any of Marcus's business debts, this property isn't reachable by his creditors. But, she added, that doesn't mean they won't try something messier. People get creative when they're desperate. Odette drew up paperwork that afternoon, documentation confirming sole ownership, and an outline for converting Whitfield Hollow into a protected LLC, with Priya listed as a minority partner, making any future claim against it even harder to pursue. I didn't sign the LLC paperwork that day. Some part of me still wanted to understand what Marcus himself thought was happening here, whether Eleanor was acting on her own out of pure panic. I texted him that evening. One line. Your mother called. Explain. He didn't respond for 6 hours. When he finally did, it was 3 words long. We need to talk. I told him to come to the house. Not the city, not a restaurant where he could control the conversation with an audience nearby. I wanted him standing on the property everyone suddenly seemed so interested in taking from me, so he could look me in the eye while he explained himself. Have you ever made someone face you on your own ground, specifically because you knew it would change the conversation? Let me know what you think below, and stay with me because Marcus's arrival at that house did not go how either of us expected. Marcus arrived 2 days later, not in the black sedan the firm used to lease for him, but in an old pickup truck I recognized from his father's garage, a detail that told me more about the state of his finances than any spreadsheet had. He looked thinner than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with a bad night's sleep. I was standing on the front porch when he pulled in, and for a moment, before he even got out of the truck, I watched his eyes move across the property. The freshly painted barn we'd converted into an event space, the string lights strung across the lawn for a wedding that weekend, and the small sign near the road that read Whitfield Hollow, established by Grace Whitfield. His face went dark. Not angry, exactly. Something closer to a man realizing all at once exactly how much he'd underestimated what I'd built while he wasn't paying attention. This is bigger than I thought, he said, stepping out of the truck slowly, looking around like a stranger touring property he was thinking of buying, rather than a man walking onto land he'd once handed over as an afterthought. It's 5 years of work, Marcus, I said. You'd know that if you'd ever actually visited more than twice a year. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked a few steps toward the barn, hands in his pockets, looking up at the beams we'd restored ourselves the first winter when we couldn't afford to hire it out. I watched him take it in the way a stranger might, noticing the details, calculating the cost, understanding for the first time that this wasn't a hobby he'd grandly funded. It was a business, and a good one, that had grown entirely without him. He didn't argue that point about visiting. Instead, he asked to sit down, and I let him because I wanted to hear whatever version of the truth he'd finally decided to bring with him. He told me about the Brooklyn project, the lawsuits, the loans he'd personally guaranteed without fully understanding what that meant until it was too late. He told me his mother had panicked when a lender's attorney mentioned family assets as potential collateral, and that Eleanor had assumed, incorrectly, that Whitfield Hollow was still legally tied to the family. She thought I still owned part of this, he admitted. I let her think that. I didn't correct her, because for a while I thought maybe I could talk you into signing something that would help. I felt something cold settle into my chest hearing him say it so plainly. Not shock, exactly. I'd half expected something like this since Eleanor's first phone call, but hearing him confirm it, that he'd let his own mother believe a lie because it was convenient, that he'd shown up here today hoping to talk me into rescuing a business built partly on the money he'd spent keeping his mistress comfortable, that landed differently than I expected. He kept talking, almost like he couldn't stop himself now that the truth was finally out. He told me about the nights he'd spent awake calculating what would happen if the firm folded completely, the employees who'd lose their jobs, the reputation his family had spent 3 generations building in New York real estate, the shame of being the Whitfield who finally broke it. I let him talk. Some part of me even understood the fear underneath it. That didn't change what I was about to say next. So that's why you're here, I said slowly. Not to apologize, not even really to explain. You're here to ask me to save you. He didn't deny it. He just sat there on the porch steps of the house I'd built, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, and asked if there was any version of this where I'd consider putting the property up as collateral, just temporarily, just enough to buy the firm a few more months. I told him no. Not out of spite, not even out of anger anymore, but because I'd spent 5 years learning exactly what this place had cost me to build, and I wasn't going to hand any part of that over to save a business built on decisions I had no say in. He asked if I understood what I was choosing, the company, his family's name, generations of work, over a piece of property I could always rebuild somewhere else if things went wrong. I told him he had that exactly backwards. This place wasn't replaceable. It was the only thing in 5 years of marriage that had ever been entirely, undeniably mine. He asked one more question before he left, quieter than everything else he'd said. Is there anything left here for us? For me and you, I mean, not just the house? I didn't answer that question right away, and I'm not going to pretend I had a clean, satisfying response ready. Would you have known what to say in that moment? Let me know below. And stay with me for the last part, because what happened over the next few weeks wasn't the ending I expected either. Like this video and subscribe. I didn't answer Marcus's question that day. I told him I needed time, and he left in that same dusty pickup truck, driving back toward a city and a business that both felt like they belonged to a different life than the one I was standing in. 2 weeks later, Marcus's firm filed for reorganization. Eleanor called me exactly once more. Not with another ultimatum this time, but with something that almost sounded like an apology, tangled up in excuses about how stressful everything had been. I listened to all of it politely. I didn't offer her anything in return, not forgiveness, not reassurance, just a quiet acknowledgement that I'd heard what she said. She talked for almost 20 minutes, circling around the same handful of justifications, that she'd only ever wanted to protect her son, that she never truly believed I'd hand the property over, that the whole thing had been said in a moment of panic she now regretted. I didn't interrupt her once. When she finally finished, I told her that I appreciated the call, and that I hoped things settled for her and Marcus soon. I meant it in a distant sort of way. I just didn't feel the need to offer anything warmer than that anymore. I signed the LLC paperwork Audette had drawn up, formally protecting Whitfield Hollow from any future claim tied to Marcus's business or his family's finances. Priya became an official partner, not just an employee, and together we booked our biggest wedding season yet, almost as if the 72-hour ultimatum had never happened at all. except it had happened, and I carried it with me in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself double-checking contracts I used to sign without a second thought. I started asking Audette to review even small vendor agreements I would have handled alone a year earlier. Some fear doesn't leave just because the threat that caused it does. There was a particular Tuesday, maybe 2 months after the ultimatum, when a vendor called asking to change our contract terms at the last minute. Nothing unusual, the kind of request I would have handled in 5 minutes before all this happened. Instead, I sat with it for 2 full days, running scenarios, imagining every way it could go wrong, before I finally called Audette just to have her glance at it. She told me it was fine, exactly what I had assumed. I thanked her, hung up, and sat at my desk for a long moment, wondering when I'd become someone who needed that kind of reassurance for something so small. Marcus and I didn't officially divorce until almost a year later. There wasn't a dramatic final fight. There was just a slow, quiet unraveling of a marriage that probably been over long before Eleanor ever picked up the phone to threaten me. I just hadn't let myself see it clearly until I had no other choice. Christine, I heard later, had left him not long after the firm's collapse became public. The Manhattan apartment apparently had never actually been fully paid off, another detail Marcus had left out of every version of events he'd given me. Priya asked me once, not long after the divorce was finalized, whether I regretted it all. The years I'd spent married to someone who could let his own mother threaten me over a phone call. I told her the honest answer was complicated. I didn't regret building this place. I didn't even fully regret marrying Marcus because some of who I'd become, steadier, more careful, less willing to hand anything over without understanding exactly what it cost, came directly out of surviving that marriage, not despite it. I think about that conversation with Priya more than I expected to. There's a version of this story where I'd tell you I came out of it entirely unbothered, sharper and stronger with no scars to show for any of it. That wouldn't be honest. I flinch a little now when a phone rings from an unfamiliar number. I still keep copies of every important document in 3 separate places, a habit that started the week Eleanor called and hasn't left me since. Some of what this cost me isn't visible in the wedding bookings or the LLC paperwork. It just lives quietly underneath everything else I do now. I want to be honest about something. I didn't feel triumphant when all of this finally settled. I felt tired, mostly, the way you feel after carrying something heavy for so long that setting it down doesn't feel like relief right away. It just feels unfamiliar. I kept Whitfield Hollow. I kept the business, the reputation, the 18-month waiting list. I lost a marriage I'm not sure was ever as solid as I once believed, and a version of my in-laws I'd spent years hoping might eventually accept me. Eleanor sent a card around the holidays, almost a year after everything ended. Just a few polite lines, nothing about the ultimatum, nothing about an apology in any real sense. I read it twice, then put it in a drawer I don't open very often. Some relationships don't get a clean resolution. They just quietly stop being anything at all. These days, I still picture Marcus's old pickup truck sometimes, parked crooked in my driveway, his face going dark as he realized exactly what he'd underestimated for 5 straight years. I don't know if he ever fully understood what this place actually meant to me, beyond its value as collateral he briefly hoped he could still access. I'm not sure it matters anymore whether he does. I built something real out of a gift everyone assumed was small. I kept it, even when the people who gave it to me decided they wanted it back. But winning that fight didn't hand me back the family I once hoped I'd have, or the marriage I thought I was building alongside it. If you've ever had to choose between protecting what you built and holding on to people who never fully valued it, I want to hear how you made that choice. Like this video, subscribe for more stories like mine, and tell me below, was it worth it to you watching me choose the house over everything else? I'll see you in the next story.